Once hostilities have begun in France, Henry V and his forces are outside the town of Harfleur, and they call on the governor to surrender. And Henry V warns the governor that if the governor does not surrender the town of Harfleur, then the city will be destroyed and the people within will face the wrath of his soldiers. He says in the third line, "To our best mercy, give yourselves," right? He says a few lines down, "If I begin the battery once again," in other words, if I have to start up the wheels of war once again, I will not leave the half-achieved Harfleur. In other words, Harfleur has been defeated and hostilities have stopped to give the governor an opportunity to surrender. If the governor does not surrender, then we're going to kick up battle again and Harfleur will be destroyed. "I will not leave the half-achieved Harfleur till in her ashes she lie buried." And Henry V goes on to make threats against the people of the city. Well, the city does surrender. And so this terrible potential fate for Harfleur is averted. As I read this passage, I think of incidents in history where we see similar things. The top photo there on the left is President Harry Truman, who takes over after President Franklin Roosevelt dies early in 1945. His vice president, Harry Truman, becomes president. Next to Harry Truman there is the Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill. And Harry Truman, at a place called Potsdam, near the end of the war, near the end of the Second World War in July 1945, he sends a warning, something like Henry V's warning. It's different in details, but he sends a warning to the leadership of Japan, and a key figure in Japan, of course, is the man below, the Emperor Hirohito. And in this Potsdam Declaration, Truman warns Japan to surrender. Now, what Truman knows is that atomic bombs have been developed. And even though many Japanese cities have been absolutely devastated by aerial bombing, a key difference is that the devastation that it took many thousands of bombs to achieve could be achieved with a single bomb, the atomic bomb. President Truman knows about this bomb. Of course, he doesn't tell Japan about it. But he does imply that we have a new and deadly weapon. When we look at the Potsdam Declaration, it says the President of the United States, the President of the National Government of the Republic of China, that government will eventually move to Taiwan when China becomes communist, the Prime Minister of Great Britain have conferred and agreed that Japan shall be given an opportunity to end this war. So there's a similarity. Henry V in front of Harfleur, I'm going to give you a chance. Truman to the government of Japan, we're going to give you a chance. The full application of our military power backed by our resolve will mean the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces, and just as inevitably the utter devastation of the Japanese homeland. And the Potsdam Declaration goes on. You see the last lines there. If Japan does not surrender, then the only alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. You see the images below. 2 atomic bombs were dropped, one on Nagasaki, one on Hiroshima, and then eventually Japan does surrender. Unlike the governor of Harfleur, the governor of Harfleur could see what was coming if he did not surrender, and so he did. The military of Japan, the Emperor of Japan, it took 2 atomic bombs for them to finally surrender. And in a different context, we could talk about why it was that the Japanese were so reluctant to surrender. It's related to what's called the Bushido Code, right? A sort of a code of military honor. The central idea being that surrender is cowardly. But the option eventually does come down to, complete and utter devastation or surrender. And Japan, eventually does surrender after these 2 atomic bombs are dropped. Another incident that comes to my mind is before the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, the underlying issue here was the I think the genuinely held belief by the president, by many in the U.S. government, by many in other governments, the government of Britain, for example. So I believe, genuinely held belief in many governments around the world that Saddam Hussein in Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. Now, it turns out that Saddam Hussein, who had such weapons, had apparently gotten rid of them. We have President Bush, who in March 2003 gives Saddam Hussein a chance. He tells Saddam Hussein, leave Iraq, you and your sons leave Iraq, and war can be averted, or at least this imminent invasion can be averted. You've got 48 hours to get out of Iraq, and perhaps conflicts can be evaded. One of the really interesting questions, which I think really is a fundamentally psychological question, is why did Saddam Hussein, rather than come clean somehow and show to the world that he did not have weapons of mass destruction, why, instead of doing that, did he allow the belief to continue that he did have weapons of mass destruction, and thereby face invasion of his country? And not only was there an invasion of his country, but he himself was found. He was in hiding. You can find pictures of him where he was dragged basically out of a hole in the ground. The image below on the left is of Hussein arrested. The image on the right is of his imminent execution, where he's hanged. It's an interesting psychological question. Why would Saddam Hussein face the invasion of his country and his own end, rather than just somehow get word to the outside world that he did not actually possess these weapons of mass destruction? One of the thoughts I've heard is just he didn't want to seem weak. He didn't want to seem like he was giving in. It's an interesting question. But here we have President Bush's statement in March 2003. All the decades of deceit and cruelty have now reached an end. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 24 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict commenced at a time of our choosing. For their own safety, all foreign nationals, including journalists and inspectors, should leave Iraq immediately, the clear implication being conflict is coming. Should Saddam Hussein choose confrontation, the American people can know that every measure has been taken to avoid war. Every measure will be taken to win it. Well, things are going to get complicated real fast. But things looked pretty clear on March 17th, 2003. Saddam Hussein was given a chance. Like the governor of Harfleur, like the emperor of Japan, context of different situations, different details, very different. But the theme holds. In the one case, the governor says yes. In the other case, the emperor says no until the 2 atomic bombs are dropped. And then finally, yes. And he actually remains emperor of Japan for decades longer. Saddam Hussein says no. Invasion comes. He himself is pulled out of a hole in which he's hanging. In which he's hiding. He's hanged, and his country is still in a very, very difficult position. Almost 2 decades later, we come to another historical case. In this case, the ending is a bit different. At the top is Ulysses S. Grant, the leading general of the Union forces during the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, here we are in April 1865, and he leads the Union forces, which overwhelm in numbers and in materiel the Confederate forces of Robert E. Lee, who is below. Robert E. Lee, many of his troops are deserting. He's heavily outnumbered. He's surrounded. And surely he knows that the war is over. There's a remarkable exchange of letters between Grant and Lee. We see this letter here from Ulysses S. Grant to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, leading Confederate general during the American Civil War. Grant writes to Lee saying, "The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance." Right? So Saddam Hussein, Bush is saying, you know that you can't win against the United States and its allies. Truman tells the Japanese, devastation is coming your way if you don't surrender. Henry V tells Harfleur, surrender or face something really awful. Here Grant is saying to Lee, look, you and I both know that this is hopeless. I feel that it is so and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. In other words, U.S. Grant makes an appeal for surrender. Now, Lee knows that it's over. He knows that it's over. He writes back to Grant and says, look, I've received your note of this day, though not entertaining the opinion you express of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia. I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood. In other words, I'm not going to acknowledge what you say, that it's hopeless, but on the other hand, if there's going to be more effusion of blood, it's going to come mostly from my side, and Lee knows that. And so he asks Grant what Grant's terms of surrender are. Now, in the case of Harfleur, the terms of surrender are pretty rough. Surrender, or your city's going to be destroyed, and the civilians are going to face the wrath of Henry V's forces. In the case of Japan, when the Potsdam Declaration is made, it's total surrender, right? You just surrender, unconditional surrender, or the destruction is coming. To Saddam Hussein, flee your country, right? Which Saddam Hussein, of course, is going to read as humiliation. That would be humiliating for him. But if you don't do this, Saddam Hussein, then game over, right? And so Lee asks Grant what his terms are, and Grant writes back. He says, your note of last evening in reply to mine of the same date, asking the conditions on which I will accept the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, is just received. In reply, I would say that, peace being my great desire, there's but one condition I would insist upon. So here comes the condition, namely, that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified for taking up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. I think we can interpret that as simply put down your weapons, and that's it. Put down your weapons and go home. Right? This is really a beautiful moment in American history. Grant, is taking that first step, I think, toward reconciliation between the North and the South. It's a magnanimous step, I think, that reflects the will of his commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln, who wants to bind up the nation's wounds. So this is very different from Henry V and Harfleur. Grant is not telling Lee, surrender, or we're going to, not only are we going to kill all of you, but we're going to ravage the civilian populations. It's very, very different. Lee, put down your weapons and just stop fighting. That's it, all right? That's basically it. And then the story goes on where Grant and Lee get together. Lee tells Grant, look, as my officers have their sidearms, their sabers, for example, as marks of respect or marks of honor. Can my officers hold on to their sidearms? Grant says yes. Lee says, look, my guys are going to have to go home and rebuild their farms. Can they keep their horses? Grant says yes. Lee says, look, my guys are hungry. Can you provide my guys with food? Grant says yes. It's incredibly magnanimous. And unfortunately, President Lincoln is assassinated about a week later. And the country takes a very, very different turn. But I think Grant here is really doing something very different from Henry V at Harfleur. There's no threat, It's, look, you're beaten, surrender, and let's end this thing and get it over with and begin the process of binding up the nation's wounds. If you've never read the account of Lee's and Grant's meeting, probably the best place to read about it is in Ulysses S. Grant's own memoir, where he writes about his defeated foe. And very interestingly, he says, I think the cause for which Lee fought was the worst cause ever the disunion of the United States, the dismemberment of the United States. And then, of course, the topic of slavery was related to that, a slave holding South, a non-slave holding North. Grant says, I think that this cause for which Lee fought was the worst cause a person could fight for. But he had high respect for Lee as a person, high respect for Lee as a man, high respect for Lee as a military officer. So a very, very different thing from what we see in Henry V. But the theme of these videos we're putting together the broad theme is the world of war in Henry V. And what we see, we see this moment in Henry V where one military adversary who has the upper hand puts out the call, surrender or else. And as we've seen, we see this reflected at different moments in history.